Hi, and welcome to Cannabis Helps Dementia. I'm Chella.
I'm Dave. And right up front, we'd like to say we're not doctors or medical professionals, and nothing you hear in this podcast should be considered medical advice.
Right.
We're not experts, but throughout this podcast series, you'll hear from doctors, nurses, researchers, administrators, other caregivers, and people living with dementia about how cannabis helps.
Like it did for our family. After my mom was diagnosed with dementia, we became fierce advocates for people living with dementia, which is how we met Dr. Jeffrey Hergenrather.
We attended our first medical cannabis conference in 2018. It was incredible to see so many medical professionals at a huge university all interested in talking about cannabis and the potential of cannabis medicine.
It was like a cannabis medicine nerd Coachella.
It was really expensive, especially for non-medical professionals.
But we went because there was going to be a panel on cannabis and Alzheimer's that we were really excited about.
That panel was terribly disappointing.
Yeah, but when they opened it up to audience questions, Dr. Hergenrather was the first at the microphone and shared his experience with assisted living facilities in Northern California.
They didn't like that.
I was second and was, of course, compelled to tell the audience that cannabis helps dementia, that there are some studies and lots of anecdotal evidence, including my own mom.
They didn't like that either. But you made your comment in the form of a question.
That's right. I followed the rules and, of course, caught up with Dr. Hergenrather right after.
Dr. Hergenrather has used plant medicine throughout his long and distinguished career and works with families and assisted living facilities in Northern California who are and have been using full-spectrum cannabis oil for years for people living with dementia.
Such valuable information from a clinician practicing cannabis medicine for a long time. In 1999, Dr. Hergenrather co-founded with Dr. Todd McOrea the Society of Cannabis Clinicians.
On the SCC website, cannabis-clinicians.org, there's a search tool where you can find cannabis medicine doctors in your area.
The Society of Cannabis Clinicians is such a valuable resource for medical professionals to connect and share latest research findings as well as what's actually happening in clinical practice. I think it's fair to say that Dr. Hergenrather is a cannabis medicine expert.
Yes, absolutely. So without further ado, here's our conversation with Dr. Jeffrey Hergenrather.
So, Dr. Hergenrather, you've known about cannabis medicine since before there was a Controlled Substances Act and Schedule I of drugs. You've used cannabis medicine in your practice even after it became illegal in 1972. How did you start recommending cannabis for patients?
It got more illegal. I was very interested in the 60s and early 70s before the Controlled Substances Act came in. That was under Nixon. And Nixon, he was bigoted and racist, and he had some qualities that made him just horrible. I mean, the things he did against cannabis were completely unethical. I mean, stopping the cancer studies, realizing that cannabis was killing cancer cells and saying, bury this evidence. You know, that's part of our legacy from Nixon. So it got more illegal while I was a medical student. So it went from being not legal to being, now we have a drug war to stop the spread of cannabis. And you know, at that point, the cat was out of the bag. It was the 70s, and things were different. So I went with my wife and living in a school bus to the farm community in Tennessee in the winter of '77. And the rest of the folks that started the commune had arrived there. Well, the first couple hundred started there in 1972. Or earlier, and we carved out a little community in the woods of South Central Tennessee, which was poor, but we loved being there together. It was a great experience, and literally hundreds of our closest friends are still those same people from that experience. It was a neat place to learn about cannabis because within the community, cannabis was revered, and we treated it as a sacrament, and we shared it among those who needed it. And if I felt like somebody really needed cannabis for their medical problem, I would usually tell a clinic lady or a midwife and say, so-and-so needs some cannabis. And then I wasn't involved in actually handling anything. I could just drop a line, and generally that would happen. So people were getting medicine, and mostly it was young adults and children, not children getting cannabis, young adults and children. That was our population curve, with 30s and babies and youngsters. And we had a few people trailing off on the population curve into elderly individuals, 60s, 70s, 80s, a few people. So I was able to see benefit with using cannabis in these older folks, reducing anxiety, helping sleep, some of the things that really point to the fact that, well, what I believe to be a fact, that the endocannabinoid system wears down. It just isn't the same as you get older as it is when you're young. And it may explain a lot of the changes that we find as we age, because people that otherwise didn't have problems like that at all in their younger years, and then they get to be elderly and now they're not sleeping very well at all. Now they're very anxious, and anxious where it's not good. It's go to the hospital with anxiety, kind of anxiousness. And these people may not have been anxious in their youth. And pain is harder to control. And really a number of other conditions that are modulated or that are mitigated by the endocannabinoid system jumping into action. And when this system isn't working as well in the elderly, we know that 2-AG and some of the natural cannabinoids aren't found in the same concentrations in the elderly and in Alzheimer's dementia. So we have evidence that this system's wearing down. And so we can use cannabis to our benefit to augment that natural system. It just makes sense.
There's so many things we can do to support our endocannabinoid system, like eating leafy greens, getting quality sleep, exercising regularly. But most of these things, in an American lifestyle anyway, are sorely neglected. Does a lifetime of neglect damage our endocannabinoid system?
I think that's true.
Yeah.
And, a good diet, good exercise, good living is important and necessary. It's an interesting article by John McPartland several years ago, The Care and Feeding of the Endocannabinoid System. It talks about getting enough of these omega-3 and omega-6 oils because they are precursors to the natural cannabinoids. If you're not really getting them, you're not taking care of your nutritional needs. So that is an important part of it as well.
You've been working with people living with dementia at assisted living facilities in Northern California for a few years now. Tell us the story of how it all began.
Well, my association with a local psychiatrist, Dr. Phil Grobe, he and I became friends through some through other friends. And when I understood he was a psychiatrist and he was cannabis friendly, we began an association that has really brought us to be pretty good friends over these years. Well, he was getting calls at a residential care facility for the elderly in Santa Rosa for dementia. And I was also being asked to see some of these patients and evaluate them and give some ideas as to how we might approach them as far as treatment. Dr. Grobe, as much as he's cannabis friendly, at the time didn't have as much experience in choosing different chemovars, what might be best. So we collaborated and we were able to share information about, let's try this, let's try that. And in doing this, we connected with the owners and the managers of this facility and the nursing staff, and probably most importantly, the nursing staff was really favoring the idea of using cannabis medicine because, among other things, they had lost people who died unexpectedly, using antipsychotics and other potent medicines, benzodiazepines, antidepressants, and so forth. So as they lost people, it was really heartbreaking to the staff, to the owners of the facility, and to the caregivers and families that this person probably died on account of the pharmaceuticals that he or she was taking rather than anything else. It was, granted, people with dementia are in the latter years of their life, but there are known adverse effects for these drugs. That's why they're often referred to as black box warning drugs. So with that set up, the owners of the facility said, please come in and help us with this. We really would like to avoid these complications, horrible side effects of chemicals that are being used, especially in the context of the fact that they don't work very well, and the patients really need to have some other alternative. So we began to intervene by saying, okay, let's try 5 milligrams of THC or 10 milligrams of THC, or let's blend it with THC and CBD. And we began to kind of work toward medicines that seemed to work best. That worked well in getting underway, and then there was turnover of staff, new nurses came in, but the program remained. And as the patients would present with agitated behaviors, psychiatric problems of significance, the families were asking for medications. They were asking the psychiatrist to intervene and see if we could help. And it turned out that the cannabis was really working better than anything else. Not unexpected for Dr. Grove and me. And it did allow us to be able to diminish or discontinue the use of conventional pharmaceuticals, which was a big deal, and everybody took notice. About that time, 2015, there were a few papers that came out saying, you know, here's a protocol we might look at for how we would treat people with cannabis. Didn't really talk about, well, there were a couple studies, but they were using trivial amounts of cannabinoids and typically synthetic single molecules, which don't behave the same as cannabis does. So we began to take some lessons from this experience, and we just stayed firm on the fact that we needed whole plant medicine. It works better. And increase the dose until we find an effective dose. So this really was about individual treatment plans. So someone may get by with 5 milligrams of each, THC and CBD, and have an effective dose. But we saw other people, we just had to keep marching up on the dose until we got up as much as 30 milligrams of each, THC and CBD, a 6-fold difference in a dose. Which, if you're running a randomized controlled trial, you don't tailor the treatment plans for each patient. You have a fixed dose, and if you're looking at a fixed dose, particularly a fixed dose of a single synthetic cannabinoid, you may not find the therapeutic benefits. And that's what we actually saw in the initial studies. There was one study that was in Boston in 1997, and they wanted to look at how well it could help appetite, because we were talking about the AIDS epidemic, people using cannabis to help with appetite and weight loss. And they did find that those that were on the synthetic cannabinoid did have weight gain. But they remarked that the more important finding was that the behaviors of these people changed so much. And again, that supported my understanding of what I was seeing cannabis do for elderly people. But it gave more of a stronghold for our approach to patients, recognizing that, yeah, it can do a lot of things for these patients. But controlling aggressive and agitated behavior is probably number one. It makes life so much different for everybody concerned.
So you haven't found any particular, most people respond to 20 milligrams of 1-to-1 3 times a day.
You know, I can say what we found, and that is, we know that the majority of patients are going to do fine with 10 milligrams of THC, 10 milligrams of CBD per dose. But the head nurse says, we know when we start them on this, they're going to be somnolent for a few days. They may sleep it off for a bit. And then what we find is that they become tolerant to the THC, and then within a few days they're up and active, and really with quite different behavior than they had prior. They're much less agitated. The behaviors are quite different. They participate in group home projects, playing games, watching movies, crossing to the game hall across the road. This is it's a little section of a community with streets and houses going different directions. And they're all part of the facility. So maybe the movie's over at this facility at 1 in the afternoon. So they have lunch, they come to the movie, and so forth. So we're finding that these these clients are much happier and do much better when they've gotten tolerant of this dose of medicine. Now, if I'm doing this with somebody in my office, I might say, okay, let's just start with 1 milligram of each. You're not going to feel this. I just want you to get comfortable and confident in using this. And then in a few days or next week, we can double the dose to 2 milligrams of each. And then we may go to 3 and 4 and 5. And over the course of a month or even more, we'll adjust the dose to find what works. And they develop the tolerance much more slowly, which is gentle, and it's a nice way to do it. It's much easier for the staff, as you can imagine, to not be changing the dose every day. Just, okay, that's the standard dose, take the dose, 7 a.m. or 8 a.m., again at 2 or 3 p.m., and maybe a bedtime dose in the evening. And if they can standardize it, it makes it much easier for everybody. Because of the way that we've designed our healthcare system and required randomized controlled trials as a way to determine whether or not a chemical, a drug, meets standards in terms of efficacy and safety. Does it work? Is it safe to use? These questions have plagued cannabis research because basically the government hasn't allowed randomized controlled trials to come to the cannabis world. There are very few. There are some studies out there, but they're very few. And that is really where we need to go head-to-head between cannabis products as well as between cannabis and any pharmaceutical product to show how well this does in fact work. How do we dose this? What's the methods of administration? And what's the ratio of cannabinoids? What's the dosing that we're going to aim for? What's the frequency of dosing? And that we have to adjust depending on some of those things that we can't control. Metabolism, for one. The rate of metabolism of cannabinoids is a bit different from person to person. So those that are fast metabolizers may need 2 or 3 or 4 doses in a day. A person who's a slow metabolizer may get by with a dose per day. So we really have to tailor the treatment plan based on that individual. And it's remarkable how different it is from person to person. So this is something you learn as a clinician, something that you have to teach to the primary care practitioners or the nursing staff to recognize we're not getting control, even though the dose is already at such and such. We don't have enough medicine on board to meet the needs of this patient. The research papers that have come out talking about protocols reinforce this same idea that the dementia patients are a good place to start. Totally makes sense. I mean, even if there were cognitive problems in a patient population of moderately demented patients, totally makes sense to use it anyway if it's going to help many other aspects of their care.
The United States Department of Health holds patent number 6630507B1 on cannabis for stroke treatment and to protect against neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. How is it that the U.S. government can simultaneously hold a patent on this powerful medicine and also say it has no medical efficacy, placing it on the Schedule I of drugs with heroin, bath salts, spice, and K2?
It is illogical. Health and Human Services holds the patent for cannabinoids for inflammation and for neuroprotection. They don't specify which cannabinoids, and the government's focus has been to vilify THC. It's been a little lax around the CBD, as you know, because CBD is everywhere, and the government can't control it, even though technically DEA might still say it's illegal, but it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere now. And people are using it, and in many cases to good benefit. So there's a gray area there about CBD. But for THC, it remains the target of the federal researchers to imply that THC has a laundry list of harms. And so the research goes to looking for harms. And if you're paying people to look for harm, you're going to write it into your abstract or write it into your conclusions that we need to be very careful. We need more research. We don't really understand this. There is some evidence that people have some cognitive issues when they're under the influence of cannabis. Well, that's a therapeutic use of cannabis. It's not a harm. It's just one of those things that goes along with a medication that has those roles in our physiology. It slows down neurotransmission, protects the nervous system in a variety of ways.
We have a friend living with dementia who doesn't have much agitation, and she was wondering if CBD would work for her. Could an isolate work for her? She's afraid of getting high. Does THC really need to be part of this protocol?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question, a common question these days. And I can't tell you how many people I have that come to me saying, we want the CBD. You know, it's like they've been hearing the media, they've been understanding that maybe CBD is the medicine of cannabis, not really recognizing the rest of the story. And if the government's out there vilifying it for, you know, prenatal use, for neonates and young adults and adolescents using cannabis, and harm to the developing brain, and gateway drug into schizophrenia and other psychiatric disorders, and on and on and on. We can look at any of those papers and dismantle them and say this study was not really controlled. When we controlled for alcohol, there's no evidence of any harm, and so forth. But this is part of the territory that we're having to negotiate. Is the public thinks that THC is dangerous in many cases. So a lot of my role is to explain we can try CBD as a dominant molecule. In medical marijuana grown for CBD, the high CBD strains, I let them know right off that it may be 20 to 1 CBD to THC. It might be 30 to 1. It might be 18 to 1, depending on the product line. But it's predominantly CBD, but it's a whole spectrum of molecules, and it works better with that whole spectrum of molecules. And don't be shopping on the internet for pure CBD. It's not really what you want. So there's a learning curve in having the families of demented patients or the families treating loved ones with cannabis to understand that THC is a player. You use as much as you can tolerate, and people get tolerant of, in many cases, very large doses of THC without any problem. Mm-hmm. You just have to typically go more slowly, or in the case of the nursing home, just fix the dose, deliver it. If you find after a week you're still too somnolent, then you might lighten up and go with half the dose. Mm-hmm. But otherwise, 10 and 10 seems to work well in this population.
How long before most people living in U.S. care facilities can benefit from cannabis medicine?
Well, we do have a difference between the RCFE, the Residential Care Facility for the Elderly, and a nursing facility. There's different regulatory bodies in California. It's much more rigid within the nursing home facility, where drugs are dispensed by nurses or nurses' aides, perhaps, at a specific prescribed dose. And when we're dealing with RCFEs, we're not really dispensing per se. It's technically you are assisting the elderly in their own care. So we're taking their medicine to them to assist them in taking it. So those facilities don't have nearly the oversight. So it's easy enough for any RCFE in the state of California, probably nationally, to be able to administer the cannabis medicine and get underway today. Okay. That's possible. Okay. But within the nursing home facilities, now we're dealing with other regulatory agencies and have to show proof of consistency in the medicine and so forth. So I think it's coming. It's just that there are more hurdles to overcome in bringing it to nursing home facilities.
How do we help our elected representatives understand that we must do something different before the Alzheimer's tsunami happens? That we must be allowed to research and in some cases use Schedule I drugs?
Some of it is reducing it to monetary terms. The cost of maintaining people in nursing facilities who are moderately to severely demented is very costly. And when we see that people can stay at home longer and they're happier, or perhaps their disease does not progress in the same way, it's going to make economic sense to use cannabis. So I think there is a place where we need to show the economics of this medicine. It makes it sensible. I do want to point out, though, that CBD, even the dominant whole plant CBD medicines, you mentioned Israel and their efforts, and particularly interesting is their efforts in treating treating autistic kids. Mm-hmm. And you know that the results have shown that one strain of CBD, high CBD cannabis, worked nicely to reduce the agitation, anxiety, the isolation, some of the learning problems that autistic kids were experiencing. And it worked very well. And then when they switched to another high CBD strain, almost identical in low THC, high CBD, it didn't work. And so this is a very important point in a cannabis specialist learning, to understand that even though the CBD is virtually identical between two strains of CBD-rich medicine, they're not going to work. One may not work as well as the other. So what they were doing in this population was treating with 100 milligrams about 3 times a day. That's a pretty good sized dose of CBD. In California, if you were to treat 100 milligrams TID 3 times a day, a common bottle of 1 ounce of tincture might cost $70 to $100 for an ounce of medicine. That is probably at a minimum 300 milligrams in the bottle. Mm-hmm. It could contain more, but it's been standardized to no more than 10 milligrams per dropper full when we first regulated this industry a year and a half ago. So now the point is, we have a situation where we can't afford $80 a day to treat somebody with 100 milligrams of CBD 3 times a day. Mm-hmm. It's way out of line. Mm-hmm. So even though it's a weed and it's cheap and it's easy to grow, most people aren't going to be able to afford that kind of medicine. Mm-hmm. It's just too expensive. Bringing in THC actually is quite a benefit, because you can drop the dosing way back down, because THC is a more potent molecule. And so now we're down at the 5 milligrams of each or 10 milligrams of each, as opposed to 100 milligrams at a dose. So it's much more cost effective when we're using some THC, and more effective when using THC.
Because it seems to make the CBD work better.
It does. Yeah, they do work better together.
You were saying in the Israeli autism study, the 2 different strains that were both CBD dominant with the same ratio of CBD to THC were actually totally different in effect. What else is in the plant that would make the 2 so different?
Well, it was at this lab that Daddy Mary pointed out about probably 2 years ago, that these strains have a vast number of minor cannabinoids. We went from saying, there are about 70 cannabinoids in cannabis. He came out and said, well, there are actually 100 to 144 cannabinoids in cannabis. Many of them don't have names yet. They just have a number that his lab has assigned to them as they come off of the gas chromatograph. So he has brought us a long way in understanding that, okay, THC and CBD may be the same, but what are the differences in the minor cannabinoids? And in 32 cannabinoids he looked at in one analysis between the strain that worked for autism and the strain that didn't work for autism, it happened to be the varin molecules that were the most different. So that may be a clue to why one strain worked and why it didn't. It's a guess. But if you look at the varins, you will recognize perhaps the name THCV. That's tetrahydrocannabinol varin. And the varin molecules are different. Instead of having a 5-carbon side chain at the end of the THC molecule or the CBD molecule, you have a 3-carbon molecule or a 3-carbon side chain. Basically, it's like putting the key in the socket, and because the key is shorter, it doesn't activate the receptor. So THCV actually has a mild blocking effect in the receptor. It's mild, though, and a big dose of THCV activates the receptor, and a small dose doesn't. It seems to block the receptor. So this may be a clue as to looking at those molecules, and when they are present, we may have a medicine that works. But again, we would need a clinical trial to really reinforce this theory as to what's the difference. That the minor cannabinoids are very important. And we're not only seeing it in mood disorders where agitated behaviors improve with one strain but not with another, but we're also seeing it in terms of managing cancer. And this has become a fairly big part of my practice in the last few years, is cancer care. Probably 30 or 35% of my patient load is cancers now, or patients with cancer. And again, some of these minor cannabinoids really play a significant role. And we may have strains that we'll be able to direct people to here in the near future. We've kind of changed from calling them strains to calling them cultivars to calling them chemovars. So we're looking at the chemical makeup of these molecules, of these plants, so that we can really optimize the treatment. And if you look again at Miri's work in the Technion Cannabis Laboratory, they're showing that one strain of THC-rich cannabis or CBD-rich cannabis may do very well at stopping the growth of a breast cancer or a colon cancer, but doesn't do much at all for prostate cancer. Whereas another strain of a CBD-rich cannabis might not do so well for the colon and the breast cancer, but do very well on the prostate cancer. So it's the minor cannabinoids that are playing this role is likely. So we're trying to bring this research along, preclinical research, to where we can direct people to the right chemovar for their cancer. So that will come. We can really personalize care and take something like a biopsy specimen, culture it, test it against a bunch of different chemovars, and be able to direct the patient to say, well, Cello over in this address and phone number has the strain you're looking for, and can provide that to you at a reasonable cost, and that may be your best cannabis medicine for this particular problem. Yeah. Individual care will come along, individualizing the care. That's amazing. So that's an exciting part. And I think we have to look at our individual genetics as a cofactor there as well. So not only choosing the best strain, but recognizing that our endocannabinoid systems aren't the same. And when we look at the genes that make these receptors, we get clusterings of different conditions. So people with a mood disorder might have a same receptor, and somebody with an autoimmune disease might have the same receptor. Somebody with a neurodegenerative disease may have the same receptor. They're not the same from condition to condition or person to person. So by, again, recognizing these differences, we're going to be able to help people fortify their cannabinoid tone and maybe, more than likely, optimize their health care by individualizing their cannabis medicine.
And the only way to clinical trials really is to take cannabis off the Schedule I, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. That would be much more sensible. Then we could do all these tests. We could start them tomorrow.
Back in the day, Eli Lilly had one of the largest cannabis cultivation fields. Do you think it's possible to talk Eli Lilly into starting up again?
I would hope so. It's about market share.
Yeah.
And about 10 years ago, I had a little brief interview at a cannabis conference, and I said the swing in the pharmaceutical industry's bottom line, if cannabis were legalized, would be scores of billions of dollars, probably annually. Some of these big drugs are bringing in $1 billion a year. And so if we're looking at a lot of different medicines that could be replaced with cannabis, I think the pharmaceutical industry just doesn't want to tangle with cannabis. They want to keep it illegal because they're selling drugs for sleep, for pain, for anxiety, for depression, for, you know, the laundry list. They have a drug for everything except for agitation and aggressive behaviors. So I'm a little pessimistic, honestly, that we can get through with local California changes. I think it's a good sign to change California or any state's Controlled Substances Act to remove cannabis from Schedule 1. I think it's a sign that the feds need to come around. But whether it actually makes a difference in research, the strings are there. The universities are very wary of this. We can't aid and abet in the patients getting their cannabis.
Okay.
We can have the discussion, we can write a recommendation, but as far as pulling something out of the drawer and say, okay, here's what you want,
Right.
we can't do that. No, we can send them to a dispensary with advice on what to find,
Sure.
but the docs have been really sidelined. We are more restricted than anybody in the world. The docs are. Technically, we can't even write it out as a treatment plan because that looks too much like a prescription.
One more question. Other drugs on the Schedule 1. Psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, was already decriminalized in Denver and Oakland. It's about to be on the ballot in other states, and it's being fast-tracked at the FDA as a treatment for depression. It seems to me that the Schedule 1 of drugs might hold some secrets that we need the answers to. Do you think that the Schedule 1 of drugs should just be thrown out the window entirely so we can explore solutions to these tricky brain disorders?
I really agree with that, and I believe that the federal government should not be involved in banning plants from anybody. I think what the federal government could be focusing on is being sure that we get an education and understand that these plants may be dangerous. These plants could kill you. These plants may be psychoactive. These plants are used in conjunction with psychotherapy and may be very effective in some patients with mental disorders, and so forth. I think education is an important role for the government to take part in, but to be banning plants, I don't think that's the role of our government at all. I think we should have full range of the plants and learn what they can do, and then with guided therapies, help people to achieve their best health.
So Dr. Hergenrather says that many patients he's worked with respond well to a 1-to-1 ratio of CBD to THC, and in a facility setting, they've been starting with 10 milligrams.
Yeah, but within a home setting, he said you can work up to your own therapeutic dose more slowly. In a facility, you want to see medicine work quickly. And while a higher dose may cause some sleepiness at first, most people get used to it within a few days.
Of course, everyone is different, but I wish we had this information when my mom was first diagnosed.
Yeah, it is so important to have a knowledgeable guide. We thank Dr. Hergenrather for all of his pioneering work and for sitting down with us to talk about how cannabis helps dementia.
You can reach him at drjeffhergenrather.com or find a practitioner in your area at the Society of Cannabis Clinicians website, cannabisclinicians.org.
Thanks for joining us for Cannabis Helps Dementia. Be sure to download and like us on iTunes.
And please share this podcast with anyone you know in relationship with dementia.
So go download other episodes of Cannabis Helps Dementia and be sure to like and share on your favorite podcasting network.
Subscribe to hear new episodes of Cannabis Helps Dementia, including one with Dr. Hergenrather's colleague, Dr. Philip Grobe.
and a conversation with the founder and head nurse of the premier dementia care assisted living facility in Northern California that's been using cannabis medicine for over 15 years.
Oh, and don't miss the episode with Gary Beal as we chat with and about how his wife Becky has been helped with cannabis medicine while living with frontotemporal dementia.
Do you want to tell your story of how cannabis helps dementia? Drop us a note or connect with us on the socials.
Check out the Society of Cannabis Clinicians website and find real medical professionals familiar with cannabis medicine in your area, like Dr. Hergenrather.
Because remember, we're not doctors, just family caregivers turned advocates.
And don't forget, download, like, and share what you learned. Cannabis helps dementia.